My name's Ben Eady. I'm the online media manager of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Business Process Modeling Across the System Development Lifecycle and its links to other BA tools. Today's featured speakers are Howard Podeswa and Mac McConnell. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, actually about 90 minutes, with a Q&A section. So make sure you submit your questions in advance using the question feature of the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to BonitaSoft for sponsoring this event, and at this time I'll turn it over to Mac to get us started.
Yeah, great, thanks very much. And I just wanted to start, so for everybody on the line, my name is Mac McConnell. I'm a Vice President at BonitaSoft, and I'd especially like to thank Modern Analyst and Howard for including us in today's presentation. The topic for today's presentation is a perfect fit with BonitaSoft and our technology. We are a full-featured business process management suite that allows analysts and process owners and IT professionals to use a visual interface to drag and drop and create a process model. Once that process design and model is created, then you can connect that process to various systems within your organization and then execute that process in an actual business application that runs the process. We are BPMN 2.0 compliant and have a lot of additional interesting functionality for analysts, such as process simulation, reporting, and many other features that you can find on our website. One of the critical elements about BonitaSoft is we really are designed to break down the barriers for organizations adopting a business process management suite. And the hallmark of that is our open source and free download that's available on our website, bonitasoft.com, where you can just download our software, get access to the Bonita Studio where you can design your processes, and really start thinking about how to implement a process-driven business application within your organization. So once again, I'd like to thank Howard and Modern Analyst. And Howard, I'll hand it over to you for today's great webinar.
All right, thanks very much. And from what I've seen of the product, love it. So I'm going to be looking at it myself. And so word to our sponsor and for everybody else out there as well. In the last slide, there'll be some links. People see that as well. So well, this is who I am, just so everybody knows. That's a self-portrait, by the way you're looking there. In my other life, I also just happen to be an artist. So, of course, lots of poetic license in the way that looks. What are our objectives for today? Well, of course, the session is all about business process modeling. What you heard from BonitaSoft is all about the use of business process modeling in a particular way, which is to actually generate some code out of that. So you can actually automate and run the business process in a production environment once you've modeled it. That is one way to use business process modeling, and during the session today I'm going to talk about other reasons for doing it as well, other contexts in which you would do it, because even if you don't have that full-fledged capability, which many companies don't, there's still a lot of value in doing it. So we'll be looking at that, what business process modeling is and why you want to do it, or why you might want to do it. I guess that's the sales pitch, aspect of the technique. We'll look at some techniques that are involved within business process modeling and some of the standards that are being used, and I guess we'll use this as a little bit of a teaching session on that for those who need to know. And I think the most important aspect of that is of the whole session to me is once we have sort of a view of what the tools are and what your sort of toolkit is, and by tool I mean again technique, not necessarily a software product, we can also talk about how what I'd like to do is actually walk you through a case study so that we can see how a subset of those tools could be used throughout a project lifecycle. Where you might use each one of those techniques and how they all fit together as well, because within this story of business processes, there are many ways to describe it. There's a UML activity diagram, for example, that a BA might want to use. There's the business process modeling notation you might want to use. There are state diagrams. There is the whole use case approach that also meshes in with this. What if you're an agile person using user stories? So how does all of this stuff fit together? First, I'd like to walk you through a project. So we'll we can actually see it in practice, and that's the best way to actually view it. And then secondly, we'll be looking at just some overall guidelines for that as well. So that's how I see the time playing out. First, I'll be very responsive to what's going on out there. During the introduction, it was mentioned about there was a mention about saving your questions or typing them in so I can deal with them later. As much as possible, actually, I'd like to deal with them as they come in. So I would encourage everybody just to ask questions as they come through, as they come to you. You know, obviously due to the number of attendees, I'm not going to be able to answer every one, but I will view them all and try to address as many as I can right in the session. So you know, while it's still a hot topic for you. Just to test how this all works, and also to just to get a little bit of feedback of who I'm speaking to, because I guess one of the challenges of working in this format is I can't see you all out there. So just to get a feel for the audience, a quick question: how many of you are programmers, either come from a programming background and are working in the BA field now, and how many of you come from from the business side? So I guess if you just type in, all of you out there, business or programming, and it will just give me as the answers flash by, I'm going to see, get a rough idea how many of each. All right, I'm watching the answers come through, and I'm getting quite a mix here. I would say it looks to me like a bit heavier towards the business side than the programming side, but fairly evenly split, quite interestingly. That'll just help me as I start to talk about the issues and get a feel for how to frame it for you. The other question I want to ask is how many of I want to just get a feeling for, I guess, how deep your own knowledge is. So I know I don't want it to state the obvious too much for people. So let's say how many of you have used business process modeling or used business process models in your work? So either just have used, not used, coming in. All right. By the way, this is a great group. A lot of responses. What I'm getting is the majority have not used it, although we have a pair group who have it as well. So I'm going to assume I'm talking to not the converted yet, but to those who are about to be. I've got Al. I just noticed that you're also a teacher, so hopefully you'll get some tips, and maybe you'll have some tips for me as well. All right, excellent. We have a Visio person, Patricia. I see you out there just minimally using it. Okay, it gives me a little bit of a feel. So we have really a broad range out there. So that's basically tells me that it's worth talking about the business case for business process modeling. So I want to address here just first what this is all about. So this slide gives us a definition, the representation of current and proposed enterprise processes, so they may be compared and contrasted. Let me sort of paraphrase that for you and just give you a feeling for how I see it. I see modeling in general as about creating an abstraction of something that exists in the real world. And that abstraction can be in any form. As a matter of fact, there's really, to me, a textual document that describes something about the business is also a model of the business. It's a representation in one form of an aspect of the business that exists in real life. So when we're talking about process modeling, we're talking about doing that sort of abstraction, but doing it about a process. So we're interested in understanding and analyzing how a business process that happens in the real world works. Why is this interesting at all? Well, because there are a lot of people who are able to do the business process or a business process without any problem whatsoever. But if you ask them how they actually make the decisions that they make, they might be at a loss, and often are at a loss, at explaining exactly how they do what they do. And so this is the value of going in as someone who is trained in some business analysis and business process modeling techniques, to be able to go in and turn that sort of gut feeling knowledge into something tangible, a picture, a diagram, some other representation. By the way, when I'm saying also that this can be an abstract representation, that is true, but of course when most people talk about modeling, they're really referring to the diagrams, but I just wanted to broaden that out a little bit. I would say diagrams plus text, even the electronic modeling file that you have if you're using BonitaSoft, you're using a Rational Rose type product or any of their other suites, products within their suites, that's a model as well. Now, in terms of standards that are used, I've listed a few here and that we're going to focus on. One is BPMN, one is UML, another one is use cases, and the one standard that I didn't talk about is the non-standard, which is people just do something that's fairly simple that gives you a feeling of some sort of flow chart. Quick question out here as well to give me an idea of emphasis. How many have used any of the standards I've talked about here, BPMN, UML, use cases, and if you've used something else, write that in as well. And if you use nothing as well, nothing at all, then none. All right, Cynthia, first one off, this should be a prize to the person who answers first. She gave us UML. I've got a lot of UML, a lot of use cases, some BPMN. That's quite interesting to me. I expected the vast majority of the answers here to be with respect to BPMN, but not necessarily the case. So fortunately, we'll cover a little bit of everything here. All right, so I don't want to talk too long about history because history is not going to make us really any better able to do our job, but just a quick flyby. When I started out, and by the way, my own answer to my own question about how did you start out, I'm a former programmer, but that's a long time ago. I haven't done programming in quite a long time. But when I started out, I encountered this topic in the form of flowcharts. I wasn't interested as a programmer to do the flowchart in order to understand the business process, though. I was drawing a flowchart in order to work out the logic of a programming module. So it's at the level of the programming that I hit it. I think that most people who did flowcharting in the early days, we're talking 60s, 70s, were doing it for that reason. It's an example of a technique that became very popular on the programming side and started to drift over toward more and more over time towards the business side. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we see some attempts to standardize this. The first flowcharts standards that I saw actually were, in my own practice, were ANSI flowcharts. And to really show you how far back I go, I still remember these green templates, and that was our business process modeling software back then. It was actually a green piece of plastic and had a little symbol for pretty well any ANSI flowcharting symbol you needed, and that's what you use to create diagrams. Now, as terms of other standards beyond that ANSI, IDEF models, those are used in the military context. Mind you, personally, I can say I've worked with military and have not used them in that. Haven't used that standard, although I did learn them in preparation for that. I like the IDEF model myself, by the way, in terms of its being the, from all the ones that I've viewed in detail, it is the one that actually provides the most precision in terms of indicating under what circumstances the next task might be done, for example. However, it is a very hard one to understand for anybody who hasn't been trained in it. It's probably one of the reasons why it never really took off in the general population. Data flow diagrams, an old technique as well. Some people might not even include it in our topic because data flow diagrams, as we'll see as we get into them, don't show workflow, but they are a way to model a process, but other aspects of the process. So, in fact, data flow, which we can tell by the name. So I'm including it in here because it's still about modeling a process, even though it's not about modeling the workflow of a process. And then there are state chart diagrams, which came in around that time as well. They were invented by Dr. Harel, came out of Israel. Those diagrams have become so useful they became part of the UML and where they're known as state machine diagrams. By the way, anybody actually use some state diagrams according to whatever name you might be calling them? Okay, yeah, we do have actually a fair number, and some people saying occasionally. We'll find that this is a type of modeling tool that's really, really useful for when it's useful, but it doesn't have as broad application as some of the other techniques. Nevertheless, I'll try to discuss with that and also with all the other tools, where they're going to be the most useful for you. There was a question that flew by earlier about are some of the principles and techniques that came from the early days, have they been incorporated into business process modeling notation? Actually, that was Brian Basu, so thanks for the question, Brian. Well, I'd say yes, in the sense that big processes that are broken down into smaller processes. That's sort of one idea that came out of those days, sub-processes. It's a way to simplify what a process looks like when you're looking at an overview. That's in there. All of the logical constructs, exclusive ORs and things like that, they've found their way into BPMN as well. So yeah, in those senses, yes. But the actual symbols being used are going to look a little bit different, of course. So I talked earlier about this idea about what, when I say a model, what does it I actually mean? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's any abstract representation, but how is that abstract representation shown to be shown? How do we communicate it? It's typically through a diagram. Diagram, I would say, plus supporting text. So it's the combination of diagram and some text that goes with it that is the model. And again, the model itself is not necessarily either one diagram. It may be a collection of diagrams and often is. So that's what I mean when I'm saying diagram, when I'm saying model. I'll show some examples later on, for example, of where diagram plus documentation fits together when you're using the use case approach, which many of you are out there. Now that's all about the actual business process model. What is a business process workflow model? We wanted to add that extra term. Workflow means the flow of work. So quite simply, it just means what work is actually done. In other words, it will indicate what are the activities, and then what is the flow of those activities? What is the order in which those tasks or activities take place? So it shows me where it begins, what happens next, under what circumstances the next step might be taken, the beginning, the ending, of course, and optionally. In some versions of a workflow model, you'll also see who does what. For any of you who use swim lane workflow diagrams, I'm talking about the swim lanes as a way of indicating that. And you may also show on that diagram business objects that are created, altered, or required at any step. I'll talk a little bit more about business objects, but for now, we can think of that as artifacts. So maybe a report is produced, or maybe the status of an application changes because of a certain step. That will be shown on the business process workflow model as well, optionally. I say optionally because there are many diagrams out there for different purposes, and each one highlights something else. The business process modeling, and particularly the workflow modeling diagram, highlights workflow. It highlights sequence in which activities are carried out. Yes, you can tack on inputs and outputs and things like that to that model, and BPMN, for example, and so does UML have ways of doing that. But the focus of the model is still going to be on the sequencing. So the next question is, now that we see what it is, why would we do it? And here are well, again, we just repeated the definition of what business process modeling is, because within that definition is also the answer. A big reason for doing business process modeling is I've got a process. For one reason or another, I want to change that process. If that's the case, then I need to have a vision of what things look like today and what things will look like tomorrow when this is actually done, to see where the gaps are. And the gaps is where work has to be done. Some of that work may involve manual changes. Different people, for example, might be assigned different roles within that business process, different tasks to do than they had before, and that actually might even be the reason why we're doing business process modeling. There was a decision made that we're going to merge two roles together, for example. And there are a number of KPIs. These are key process indicators that we might be looking for as rationales for why we're doing this business process modeling. So one example here is reduced turnaround time. We've got a business process that's now taking too long to go from A to B. I'm going to look at an example later on where an insurance company, for example, wants to improve the process for handling insurance applications, or it might be applications either for the insurance or applications for a claim, for processing a claim. And so that's the rationale. That's maybe the initial reason why that business process needs to be changed, and then we'll use business process modeling to see where we want to go, where we are today, and what the gaps are. I mentioned that those gaps and fixing those gaps can be all manual, different people doing different jobs, or they may involve an IT component. In other words, maybe in order to reduce turnaround time, The main thing we need to do is actually automate the processing of those applications, and instead of handling them manually, the way it may be done today. So there's a case of a project which has an IT component into it, and I'll be actually walking you through a case, seeing how we go from the start of that project through to the end, highlighting the business process modeling throughout that. Other KPIs: increasing throughput, a number of transactions that we can handle through unit time, increasing efficiencies and resource utilization, the way that people and resources are being used. For those of you out there who have been doing business process modeling, can you just give me in a few words what the business context was for doing that modeling? Why did you use a business process model? Was your goal to reduce turnaround? Was it hardware driven? All right, not much in the way of answers on that question. I may be running into a case also where we're hitting into some confidentiality issues, so that's fine as well. Oh, hang on a minute. I'm seeing. Yes, I'm sorry. They're coming through. We have increased throughput that's come through from Gary. Just highlighting a few of the answers that came in. Here, Marianne is an outside consultant coming in to discuss how the product they're implementing will be used in the business. Someone's writing it, putting it here for the nailing of requirements, reducing the turnaround time, type of things that we're seeing here on this slide. To eliminate waste. In an agile world, the definition of how does it go? The definition of efficiency is maximizing the amount of work not done. So yes, this is a great technique to actually achieve that. So now in terms of business context for business process modeling, then you've given me some of these right here. These are some of the rationales that I've seen just in my own experience with it. A business merger or a takeover. A bank takes over another bank or a group of other banks. Now, each of those banks currently has their own business process for handling something that actually is a common issue across all banks. What do we do about that? Well, we can decide to let everybody go their own way. Most likely, the holding company or the company that bought out the other one is wanting everybody to use the same process, or at least finally over some time, or at least standardize it to some degree. And so you start to do a gap analysis between the process that maybe the main company has, the processes the other ones do, and then based upon that, coming across a solution. It might be to take, for example, the owning company's, the purchasing company's business process, and add in any features that they need from the other ones to produce one comprehensive process. So that's sort of one reason. The business objective was to be able to accommodate the merger. Another is an introduction of new products or services. Very common issue. We're right now dealing with a telecom company, for example, and a big issue for them is, yes, we're going to be releasing a new phone, or we're going to be releasing a new service to go with that phone, or and so because of that, there are new business processes that have to support that. So that's the rationale. Another reason is transformational change. We're changing a business process that is key to the business and just transforming how it is done. So it's really going to change the way that work is done. Going back to an insurance example I gave earlier, you may have a company that their model, or the way they work today, is that an agent sits down with somebody in their home, discusses with them, the parameters of the insurance application, and then fills out an application by hand. And then that application goes through a series of steps, many of them manual, until it gets processed, and that takes a long time. A transformational change would be for someone to walk in there with a wireless device and be able to capture all of that information automatically or on-site at the client's office, and then ship that off and have the entire process, the entire application being dealt with automatically. Big transformational change there. Another look is business process improvement, and many of you have been giving me, sending in examples of a business process improvement example. Identifying and removing bottlenecks, reducing double entry. I'll talk of an example like that. Rule changes we talked about earlier. And sometimes the sort of initiative to the whole thing didn't start at the business side at all. It started at the IT side. We're making an IT change. One organization we went into needed to remove, needed to get ready for a change in their entire system and the whole for handling all of their processes. And the rationale was not about efficiencies or any of these other things. The rationale was the hardware that they were running on, and actually remember this case, was an old Wang system. It was limping along, and they knew that the time would come when there would be a part that they needed to replace that they couldn't anymore because that model was no longer out there, and so they had to prepare for a major change. So, but it just may be that you're swapping out even some middleware, for example, or an aspect of the system that's maybe instead of having one system handle instead of having two different systems or three different systems handle everything, you may have decided, your company may decide that one system will handle everything. So it came from the IT side. Now the reason that I bring this one up is extremely important because many people believe that business process modeling is important if it's the business process as a whole that is being redesigned, and that is the rationale. And in fact, it's that type of a project. What I like to just remind people here is that even if it's a project that starts at the IT side, we need to do some business process modeling as well. And why? Because we want to make sure that we really investigated the upstream impact of the change that we're making down on the IT side. What change will this make in terms of the overall business process that's going along, which may include some manual steps and maybe some other automated steps that are outside the scope of our project. I know that when we first actually started bringing this into companies, and one of the companies that were using the use case approach, we packaged this whole issue of business process modeling within the issue of business use cases, which I'll talk about a little bit later. I did a little needs analysis with each group that I came in to train. It was a bank that we worked with in that particular case, and found that many of them were not using business use cases. So I asked their managers, how much time do you want me to spend on this? And they actually told me in the end, we want you to spend half the time, even though they're not doing it today. Why? Because a big issue for them was their programmers were making changes on the IT side, but were not considering the business context in which those changes were going to be dropped. Balaji, I just got your question about some BPMN tools. I'm not sure which are openware, which are not, so I will get back to you on that. If I don't have time during the workshop, or during this webinar, my address is howardpodeswa@nobleinc.ca. If you send me an email, I'll send you back an answer with a more complete list, and that'll be at the last line as well. By the way, just to quickly answer that, of course, one of the software products that you could use is our sponsor right here, BanitaSoft, and that's open. It's open, it's free, and available to all. And their website is also going to be at the you'll find on the last slide as well. Now, going back to this idea of the IT side, in other words, projects which initiated from the IT side. Why is it important to look at business process model when maybe that's not really the focus of our project? Well, that is, and I'd say even broader. Let me just say, even take this step further. Any project where there is going to be an IT solution component. The question is, how does this all fit in? Well, if there's going to be an IT solution component, whether it's a new process that you're creating, a business process that is going to be revised, or maybe even a minor revision that happens from the IT side, we need a clear path that would take us from what the initial business need was, what business processes are actually going to be affected by that initiative, and then which tasks within that business process model are going to be automated, because it's only those that are going to find their way into the IT solution. And then finally, we start deriving IT requirements for this part of the IT solution. So in other words, if you're on the development side, you don't necessarily care about all the little details, the manual things that are going on around there, but that doesn't mean that business analysts should not care. Business analysts actually begins at that business process side to look at the whole environment, and then drills their way down to the IT side, so that we don't run into a situation where we've dropped something into the business and the business is not really able to handle it well. And so a quick overview of how this all would fit together, and I've just put down some phase names, generic phase names. These names will be different in every type of project management system you're using, but generically most life cycles begin with some sort of an initiation phase. In RUC, for example, the Rational Unified Process, they call this the inception phase. Some people refer to this maybe as their sprint zero if they were in a Scrum environment. So in that initial phase, the idea usually is if you're an agile Scrum person, it's where do the user stories that go into the product backlog, where do they get there and when do they come in there? Well, the initial ones will come in during this phase. If you're using the use case approach, then we would say the system use cases, and we'll define that term, but they represent basically the user tasks that are going to be required to implement the changes to this process. When do we identify them? We do enough work during this initiation phase so that we can get a fix on the main use cases, the main tasks. So in order to do that, we need to look at, then again, this is within the context of a project that will require an IT solution as part of its solution. When do we do that? In the beginning phase, typically, and you'll find this, for example, in the Rational Unified Process, we'd be looking at business process models for the processes affected today. We'll be looking at how we want that to look in the future once we've come to a consensus about how it should change. We look at the gaps, and then based upon that, we can drive towards what the actual tasks are, the high level, or I guess maybe it's more, I would say maybe a mid-level version of IT requirements. In the next phase, discovery, if you're using a non-agile process, then the next phase is all about gathering upfront the detailed IT requirements. They'll be in the form of system use cases if you're using the use case approach, and that happens in the next phase. If we're using an agile approach, then these next steps that I'm talking about happen really within a sprint. So within a particular sprint, we'll be looking at, okay, in this sprint, we're going to do these and these user stories, which roughly, and I know very roughly, translates into use cases or system use case scenarios. So we're going to pick these items, but I don't know anything much about that particular item. So during the iteration in which you're going to develop that item, you get the more detailed requirements for that item. Might be, if you're using the use case approach at this point, we'll be doing use case specifications. Whatever you're calling it, what we're doing now is finding out in a little bit more detail what the workflow is going to look like for that IT task. So notice the use of the word workflow, so workflow modeling issue. Now, the next step, if it's a sprint that you're doing, or the next phase, if we're talking about a more standard waterfall type approach, is the construction step, and that is to actually create the software to handle that, the software to implement those changes. We're going to use the models again as input to doing that. In other words, if I can do a rough sketch about that explains how the dialogue is going to go back and forth between the user and the IT, in other words, the user-IT interface, as a sketch of that, then I can use that to actually create the code as my basis for the code. And finally, the business process models become useful again, even after all that's done, because even once that's done, in the end, we're going to have a lot of pieces, and all of these automated pieces have to fit together with the entire business process, which may involve, and that whole end-to-end business process, may involve various things, may involve some manual steps, may involve some steps that are actually accomplished through other external systems. We want to make sure that everything fits together. If we go back to the original business process model that we drew for the to-be process, we should be able at the end to put together all our little pieces and everything should work well. In other words, let's take processing of a claim as an example. I should be able to, yes, I may have worked out the requirements for submitting that claim. I may get all the requirements for adjudicating that claim and all the other little pieces, but I want to make sure that when all is said and done, I can put in an application, or a claim, and it'll actually go through all those things seamlessly and then produce the desired result. And if the part of it's manual, it may take a long time, it may take over a number of days, but we would like to be able to make sure that we can integrate all the pieces together. The business process model comes, is helpful for that. So a few minutes just to make it real for you, some case studies. What I've done on these slides is I've had to, in fact, just made some last-minute changes as well, just before the webinar, just to generalize them enough, because obviously for confidentiality purposes, I couldn't keep this clear enough that it's going to be recognized. It'll be recognizable to the client is. But here's our first example. This is actually something that our company Noble is working on right now with an organization. So this organization provides services to its customers. From this organization, you can get licenses, you can get grants. So they both accept money, dish out money. I guess I can push a little bit further maybe and say perhaps it's a governmental organization. So now if it's a governmental organization, then some of these licenses and some of these grants and some of these other things as well, they'll be handled by different departments within that organization. And every one has its own software to deal with all that stuff, and it's got its own processes for dealing with everything. And so the decision was made with this particular client that they said, no, we don't want to. We want all that to be hidden from our customers. And how are we going to hide that? Our customers should be dealing with a single point of contact, and that represents the organization as a whole. And then we want to make it easy because everything else, all the rerouting to various departments, we want that to be invisible to our customer and make things really clear for them. So that was the rationale. What it meant in order to be able to achieve that, and what we're actually in the process of doing now, is first of all looking at the as-is processes. How is licensing, granting, and so on handled in each of the various departments? What are good, the to-be will be to have this through one central portal. What are good candidate processes to include, let's say, in the first phase of the project? And then what do we have to do? What are the discrepancies? And what do we need to do to make sure that it's handled in one way? So that's sort of one type, this idea of centralizing processes. Let's just have a quick look here. I can think of another example. We're working with another large institution, financial institution. They made a decision that actually was on the training side. So they deliver training, but every department within that institution has its own processes for putting a course together and getting it on the system, for registering students and so on and so on. It made sense, of course, for this all to be done by one central body, but in order to do that, you have to make sure that whatever centralized process you have can handle all the little discrepancies and the particular needs of each department. So again, business process modeling to look at how each department does it, to look at which are the best targets, for maybe the first iteration of centralization. And so, another example of centralization being the beginning point, the spark that started the whole thing off. Here's another one for inefficiencies. A number of answers that came in, said, yes, we're doing business process modeling for that reason. So here's an example. There's another company that we dealt with. They had services they provided to their customers. They had a customer relations management system that worked like this for historical reasons, and it's almost always there's a historical reason for this. They have two IT systems going. One of them handles customers before they are customers. In other words, they see a prospect, there's an opportunity. This system handles, keeping track of what the opportunities are, who the contacts for these opportunities, and so on, putting together a proposal and all of that up until the time where you get a win. Once you get a win on the proposal, they now have to sort of imagine that the chair is now swiveling to the other side, and they now have to start inputting to yet another system which handles their customers once they really are truly customers. Now, what that means is lots of double entry. I've already inputted a lot of customer information to one system. I want to put them into another. As many of you know, there are a lot of ways to handle this problem. One is to keep the two systems and just have some automated process that goes and and grabs information that was newly entered into system number 1 and puts it into system number 2. Another one would be to create a whole new system or buy a new system that would do everything. And yet a third option is to take one of those systems and expand it so that it will do the functions that are currently done by the other system. So for example, if we took system number 1, which is currently only being used for prospects, perhaps we can expand that so we can also use it for wins. If I remember correctly with this one, this one happened a long time ago, they took the opposite, by the way. They took the system and wins. In fact, I can remember now it was CMS Open, and the system number 1 was PeopleSoft. And they decided to tweak CMS Open so that it could do everything for them. So again, in order to do all that, all these lovely things we've talked about, you need to have a good understanding of what's currently going on today to make sure you don't miss anything. Yet another example, decreasing turnaround time. That was one of those KPIs we saw before. So here's a company that is currently currently filling out applications manually and wants to be able to fast track. This particular company found that the vast majority of their applications could be fast tracked. So why weren't they? Well, the answer was they didn't have the capability. So the big change is to allow for that. So I hope that will give you all a bit of a feeling for under what circumstances this kind of work is being done. What I now want to look at is what the actual tools are, the actual learning. That was really all of it, a sales job, I guess, in a sense. So now, what are some of the techniques that we have available? Well, this is a BPMN stands for Business Process Modeling Notation. I put it first here because actually I'd assume that most people would be using it, although, again, we found that just from the questions and answers coming back that probably actually doesn't seem to be the most popular amongst the group here, just from a quick sample. A little bit about it and why you might think of using it versus another standard. It's, I mean, sometimes the biggest reason for using a particular technique is because it's already popular. The popularity breeds popularity. That's actually the case for business process modeling notation, I would say. Why? What do I mean? Well, there are tools like BonitaSoft, which are out there. Sorry, there's a little plug for you guys again. That are out there. I'm not being paid, by the way, to do this. That are out there, and because BPMN is viewed as, by many as the technique to be used for modeling business processes. That's, a tool. People who create tools are, go to great pains to make sure they can produce a tool that is in compliance with that standard. And so that's where we are today. It also means that you're more likely to get programmers and analysts who are familiar with that notation. And because it's a standard which focuses on the business process modeling side. It's not one of many things it does. They can actually do a very good job of it. As far as a little bit of history on it, who's in charge of it, www.omg.org, which you're seeing on this, is the URL for the object management group. They manage this standard today. It wasn't like that originally. It was originally BPMI, another organization who did it, but they were taken under the OMG's wing. They now handle that, and it's sort of like Coke owning Pepsi. They own not only that standard, but they actually own the first standard to own before this one was the UML, Unified Modeling Language. And guess what? They also, it's also managed by the OMG, and then the UML standard has a business process, has more than one business process modeling diagrams. The one that I recommend mostly for BA purposes is the activity diagram, and they have others like sequence diagram, which are great once you're getting into the design side. Now, someone is asking about case studies. This is from Brian again. Brian, you've got some great questions here. Keep them coming. The first question, the question I'm looking at here has to do, are there case studies showing success with BPMN modeling without the company actually owning the tool? Actually, I can't address that one, but I can say I've certainly seen people do it and get a lot of benefit out of it. This question about BPMN is a question of BPMN versus the UML. Actually, I have a blog on that on ModernAnalyst.com. which addresses that question. But basically, I could say the answer is yes. But I need to know what we're comparing. We're comparing, let's say, a UML activity diagram, which would be the main UML option for a BA, versus the business process modeling notations, diagrams, public and private processes. Yes, BPMN does everything that that activity diagram does, or anything useful to you, I would say, as a BA. And it does a little bit more. It has, but that's not a huge difference. But the one thing I like about it is it has something called an inclusive OR, which is a construct that's quite useful in the business context and does not have a UML equivalent. Other than that, I would say they're pretty well toe-to-toe. I would say that there's a perception out there that BPMN is the easier diagram to follow than the activity diagram. And I say perception because I believe that perception came there because activity diagrams are part of the UML. The UML came out of the programming community. It's now used in a much wider way, but it's still viewed as a programming standard. And BPMN has got the word business in it, must be a more businessy one. But if you actually look at the diagrams, actually look at them, and we'll see some examples, I think you'll find that the activity diagram is actually much easier to understand. But one of the reasons is it has less symbols, just a much simpler thing to use. So we'll get back into that, but at the moment I would say it's not, I wouldn't say that the answer is primarily functionality. You use one versus the other because of things like tool support and popularity. So enough talking about it. Here we get into a little example coming up right now. And John, this is to answer your question. Will I show examples of what BPMN might look like? That's John Cusick. So here's an example of what it might look like. What you're looking at now is something called the public process in BPMN. Now, it's not just BPMN, but in fact any modeling approach that we're going to use is going to differentiate between two different views of a business process. They may use different names for these things, but they're always going to have a differentiation of some kind. In BPMN world, we refer to these as public, versus private. So a public view of a process is, if I'm a customer interacting with you, the business, what aspect do I see? And I don't really care about what's going on inside your company. I just want to know what I see. The public process shows me that. And by the way, whenever I say a person, I also mean an external organization, and I even mean an external computer system as well. So what do entities outside of our business, how do they experience our process? And one thing they don't see is everything that's going on inside. And they shouldn't. So just to take you through it here, you see an example of a claim on the left. First let's start broadly. I'll take you right through this. Those rectangles going across, for those of you who are really new to this stuff, that's called a pool. A pool represents a business organization, and each of these pools, the assumption is they run fairly independently from each other. So it's often, it could be a department of a company which has its own business organization around it. They do their own, they've got their own processes, they interact with the rest of the company in limited ways. Usually we're actually talking though about another business entirely. So here I've got the customer, who is certainly external to us if we're, let's say, an insurance company. We have claims. Now within claims, within the insurance company, maybe we're focusing only on the claims department, and perhaps this claims department is a self-contained unit. And so it's its own pool. Then we have another pool that represents policy management. It may or may not be within the same company, but the assumption here is that they operate fairly independently. So claims will handle everything to do with the day-to-day handling of, if it's house insurance, then I got such and such damage happened to me on such and such a date. Here's the money that I would like to in order to make the fix. That's kind of what the claims people do. Policy management are all about the more long-term things. I'd like to buy a policy. I want to make changes to my policy. We need to verify a policy. So that's what policy management is all about. And then finance might be the area which handles payments, for example, either money coming in or money coming out to the insurance company. So here we have these different pools. Now let's take a look at the story. The story begins with the start. So They call that a start event within BPMN, and so here I've got a start event in claims. The first step is the receiving of a claim. What kicks off the receiving of a claim? Well, it's the fact that a claim came in from the customer. And so if you're looking over on the left, you see a claim inside a box. In BPMN, that's called a data object. And you'll see an arrow that it is attached to with dashed lines that says submit claim. That is a message. That's the term being used anyways. A message is really, I'm not sure I love that term. From a business analysis point of view, it's more like a request. The customer is sending in a request. Please submit my claim, right? And they're sending it to the claims area. And they don't need to know who within claims is going to handle it. There may be a number of functions within that deal with various aspects. It's public, so we don't care. And I put in the received claim at all. I could have actually not put that in and just shown a message going to claims without even saying what the task was, because that little box there, received claim, is a task. The reason I put that in is I wanted to highlight the tasks where there was some kind of a handoff going on, something being handed from an external entity to our system that we've decided to focus on, which is claims here. So the next time something like that happens, and there could be many steps in between, but the next time something like that happens is when we verify policy coverage. Why? Because as I mentioned earlier, the way we've bounded all of this, claims handles claims. But policy management handles anything to do with the policy itself. Well, I want to see, before I submit a claim, if I'm working on the claim side, whether or not this person even has a policy with us, whether this policy would cover this type of an incident. And so I've called that check coverage. That's my little message. Being sent from claims out to policy management, and an answer comes back. You don't need to show, by the way, the answer coming back, but I've shown it here, the coverage response. Now, after that, other things may happen, and we're going to see them happening soon when I look at the internal view of this process. But we can say overall that if it is denied, if this claim is denied, then we want to send a denial of coverage to the customer. And that's where you're seeing a message and also an object attached to it called the claim rejection notice. And on the other hand, if things go well, an approval goes there. And if it's approved, you need to issue a payment. But since our business area does not do that, it's finance that does that. We send a message. Hey, finance, can you do that? Now, this is a logical model. I don't have a lot of details. I don't yet know, and I haven't really indicated yet whether the issuing of that payment happens because I scribble a little note and say, hey, you at finance, can you do this for me? Or because there's some screen that I can go onto, or even without that, there's some automated way where this approved claim payment gets sent as an electronic financial transaction to finance, to the system that handles finance. But conceptually, it's the same. That issue's happening at this point. Now, on this slide, we've seen it all blow up because I think it's very important to get an idea how outsiders are going to see it and how we communicate with external systems. But it becomes important as well. Eventually, you've got to take this further. So let's say this was something new that we were about to do. We're about to automate the way claims are handled, where maybe it's all being done manually today, just to use that as an example. We've identified in that early step what the process is and how it communicates to the outside world. Now we start to dig in, and so we look at the private business process. That just means the internal way that it's carried out. So just looking at a little note here. All right, Brian has asked me about how these interfaces can happen. Interfaces between systems can handle many ways. It's basically some sort of message a request is sent to another system. Technically, as a programmer, what does that look like? I've actually sometimes had to actually write the detailed coding to make that happen. We usually have some kind of in my cases I was involved in, there was some sort of file that one system dropped records into, and then the others, and that record represented what the request actually was and parameters to that request. So if I want system A to issue a payment, it'll be, it'll say not just issue a payment, but the parameters will say who that payment is issued to, how much, and so on. That system is polling that file all the time, and when it picks up something new that came in, It's able to, then there's some coding in there that says, if it's this message, go to this function. If it's this one, go to another one. Parameters are passed to it, and it handles it. Sometimes I've worked on systems where the communication didn't involve a file, but it involved a common area of memory that both were able to access. So there are many ways to play that game, but one way or another, they talk to each other. So in this, let's go back to what the private process is saying. What does it give us some more detail? It shows us, for example, that between verifying a policy and making a decision about that policy, things happen. And what are the things that happen? Well, we have here, after verify policy coverage, there's a diamond. So that diamond is referred to as a gateway in BPMN. Most people, you probably think of it as a decision if you've done other kinds of flow charting, and that's all that it is. And interestingly enough, almost every flow charting method I've seen uses the same symbol for decisions. It's the diamond. We have one arrow going out saying denied, another arrow which has a slash on it, and no label. The denied means if the policy, if the claim has been denied, then go here. And where is the here? Deny coverage, the next task. The slash means default. In other words, if it's none of the above, because there could be 2, 3, any number of flows going out of that diamond. If none apply, then take the default. In other words, if it wasn't denied, if it was okay, that's what this all means in this circumstance, then assign an adjuster. Somebody has to adjust that claim. Now, who does that? Up until now, we've seen that it was the customer service rep who did that. How do I know that? Well, because within the claims pool, I have now added 3 horizontal compartments. Each of those compartments is referred to as a lane within the pool. And that lane really just represents a participant, a player within the story. So it was the customer service rep who picked up the claim initially. That's a piece of detail we have now that we didn't know before. All going well, it's a manager of client services who then assigns an adjuster to the claim. All going well, it's then an adjuster who picks up the story from there, visits the site and submits a report, and then from there we have the resolution of the claim, and that's handled again by the manager, and the process ends. So it gives us some more detail about how things go, and if we think about, a common question I asked at a managerial level or maybe an executive level is, how do I go from a business problem statement to IT requirements? Well, this is a key step in doing that. How do I go there? I go there by looking at the business problem as it's articulated. From there, identifying what the business processes are that are going to be affected. For each business process, looking at, as we're doing here, either an existing model documentation of what the process looks like, or developing it ourselves if it's something totally new, or if there is no documentation for it, just exists in people's heads. And then zeroing in on the tasks that I've discovered and starting to play with them, starting to until they represent the new situation, and then starting to focus on which of those tasks are manual and which of them are going to require IT. Once I've circled those things, and I actually physically will circle them soon, we then know what the IT requirements are, or at least we have an idea what those tasks are. And they're going to lead us actually to our user stories and our use cases. There was a question here about from Marianne, very good question, I'm glad you asked that, is do I do this on a flip chart while facilitating, or do I use a tool? I can speak for myself. I never use a tool while facilitating. I do it all on a flip chart. Why? It's just much faster to respond very quickly. I don't want to be burdened by the use of the tool. The tool can be very useful later on for formal documentation, for simulation, for process automation. But while in front of the stakeholders, I do it flip chart-wise. There's going to be a lot of changes going on, and as we'll see, a big reason for me using a picture is because it's a way to consolidate the views of many into one consolidated picture. So back to our processes. So that's there we've seen BPMN. I'm going to return to that a little bit later when we go through a full case study. Right now, all I'm trying to do really is just give you the toolkit. Right? We open up our kit. What can we use? Many of you are UML people. So for those UMLers out there, the tool of choice, I would say, for business process modeling is the activity diagram. Well, by the way, someone has also mentioned here, Marianne, going back to you again, the pre-configured using sticky notes. I'm going to just talk about the sticky notes for a second. A great suggestion. I'm glad you brought it up because I would have forgotten to say that. Because a lot of your work involves moving things around when you're modeling. For example, maybe these tasks should happen in different orders, or maybe a different person should do that task. So I'm going to want to move it from one spot on the diagram to another. A great little tool is just to use a sticky note, just a post-it note. Write the task on that note, and then if you need to change the order in which it happens, just move it to a different spot on the flip chart. Very, very useful. A question came in as well from Rahmatullah Muhammad, the difference between a pool and a swim lane. So just to quickly go back to that one again. We use a pool for independent organizations that usually different businesses that communicate in very specific ways. For example, I can't go into the middle of a process that happens in the insurance company. I can send in an application and wait for an answer, but what happens in between, I'm not able to do that. So I'll be a pool, and the insurance company will be a pool. The lanes within that pool represent typically a department within that company. And formally, what does it mean? Within BPMN, between lanes, you can have flows going. In other words, you can show the sequence. You can say this activity happens next, and an arrow goes to the next activity, and so on and so on. So all that's allowable. However, when it comes, so they call these flow objects. When it comes to pools, the only kind of arrows that can happen between pools are those dashed arrows that we saw versus the solid ones I was talking about just before. The dashed arrows represent messages, so I can make a request of another business and wait for an answer, but that's all that I can do. Typically, that other business it reaches some point where it's waiting for that request to come in, and as soon as the request comes in, it can respond to it. So back to, here's an example of an activity diagram. Now here we see lanes again. So these are lanes within a pool. They don't use the word pool within UML, but everything at whatever level it is referred to as a lane or a partition. So I'm not going to use the partition word because it's so techie sounding. So here we've got marketing, local office, pursuit team, national client acceptance. These are different departments within the organization. These would have been lanes in BPMN, and so they are here as well. By the way, don't be perturbed by the fact that I've drawn this one vertically and I drew the BPMN diagram horizontally. Within the UML activity diagram, you can go horizontal as well. Most of the tools that I've seen that use UML activity diagrams do it vertically. And I think the only reason is that it's very easy to scroll up and down, and a little bit easier than scrolling left and right when you're using a tool. But that's the only reason really. So again, I've got a start button here, and notice how similar that was. We had a start event, looked the same. I have an arrow going from the start to identify target client, just as I had beforehand in BPMN. The only difference here is that it's an open-headed arrow, and if you go back, or if you think back, our BPMN diagram showed it as a solid-headed triangle at the end of the arrow. These things are important when you're obeying standards, especially the UML, because boy is it picky about those arrowheads. I actually had to, my own book, UML for the IT Business Analyst, the publishers did me a favor and changed all my arrowheads just before it went out to be published because they thought they would look nicer. And I just had a fit because in UML, the arrowhead means so much that suddenly none of the diagrams are valid anymore. I had to get them to remove that book from the market before too much damage was done and put out, and put out another version of the book. And hopefully none of you out there got the bad one. So yeah, that's how important it can be. But I just want to say conceptually, it's very little different so far. You remember what the task looked like in BPMN? Oh, let me just flip back. There it is. A rounded rectangle. Look what you're looking at over here. It actually is almost the same, except that the left and right-hand side is not something straight with rounded edges. It's a curve. It looks more like a capsule. That's not a huge difference. So here this tells us marketing targets the client, the local office selects a pursuit team, the pursuit team members opportunities and contacts, creates a plan, national client acceptance then does some validation, records what they've done. If everything looks okay, they launch a pursuit. If not, they abandon the pursuit and everything ends. Look at the diamond over on the right where it says national client acceptance, where my cursor is right now. That's called a decision here on the UML side, and there's nothing, different about the way that diagram looks, that diagram and component looks. What is different is the word accepted and the word rejected, and I'll just put the mouse over there so you can see it, accepted, rejected. They're in square brackets, and that indicates, in the UML terminology, we call that, ooh, that's a guard. A guard just means a condition that must be true before you can go along this path. It looked exactly the same in BPMN, except we didn't put square brackets around it. The square brackets are very important though in the UML, so we could do a whole lesson just on peculiarities of the UML. But what I want to get across is, look at this diagram right now. Just take a moment. If you didn't know anything at all about modeling, would you understand this diagram? By the way, give me an answer on that. Yeses or nos? All I'm getting is yeses. So I hope now when somebody complains to you about how terrible the UML activity diagrams are because they're so complicated, I don't know what they're talking about personally. I don't find this a complicated one at all, and it seems that many of you agree with me as well. There's a question here from WebHub about how do you indicate diagrams which sub-processes. The way that I would do that here, and I don't think I have an example, is within, let's say that validate pursuit plan over on the right had had its own little diagram to explain how that happens. Inside the lozenge symbol that's here, I put the rake symbol. It looks like a, I wish I could draw right now on here. I don't have the tool, but it looks like a rake, like a fork. There's a line going down, and it's hard to describe. A horizontal with let's say a line going down and some prongs coming out of it at the bottom, and that sort of to make you think, oh, this thing decomposes into other little pieces. Then we would draw a separate diagram entirely with the same name, validate pursuit plan, and maybe even draw an enormous blown-up version of that bubble or that lozenge shape. And within it, we would draw a new activity diagram that would have its own start. By the way, somebody asked me earlier, does every swim lane have to have its own start? Does every pool have to have its own start? Every swim lane does not have to have its own start. In fact, there will be one start for the process for the entire pool across all swim lanes, so just one. However, if you are showing now you can have other pools you might not be so interested in, so you may not show what process they're going through at all, in which case there'll be no start. But if you are going to show the process of the other pools, then yes, each of them will have their own start event, or if we're using the activity diagrams, their own start button. Now, another diagram here. Question, Brian, you asked me, oh, we've got these great questions. Do you need to be proficient in data modeling if you are a practitioner of business process modeling? No, you can do one without the other. It's nice to have both because business process modeling focuses on the verbs primarily, and every so often, if you like, you can throw a business object in there to show where data is being created or modified, or artifacts are being created and modified. It's nice to be able now to turn over at that point to a data model which will explain more about what that little data piece actually is. So for example, if at some point an application is created, or at some point a policy is created, it would be nice at that point to go over to a data model and actually look in more detail at that noun, at that policy. So it's useful, but it's not necessary. All right, going back to the slide that we're on now, 27. The next tool that we're looking at is the functional decomposition diagram. And what am I looking at here? It's probably a diagram that many of you have seen in one form or another. In fact, I'm going to flip right to it. You might think of this as a structure chart. If you're a programmer, back in my days when I did COBOL programming, I'm dating myself here, but I know I've done C++ as well and all that stuff. But back in those days, we started off with a main system. Yes, John, back in the day, and broke it down into subprograms, and those are broken down into sub-subprograms, and so on all the way down the line. And this showed the way that all those pieces actually fit together. So we can still do that today. In fact, if in a, say either an activity diagram or in a business process modeling diagram, BPMN diagram, I show a process, and that's a collapsible process. That's the BPMN term for it, or a collapse process, or a super process. Both mean the same thing. So I've shown it at a high level. And that process actually breaks down into sub-processes. And then if I look at that diagram, it breaks down. It has its own collapse processes. It would be nice if I would have a picture that would just show how all of those diagrams fit together. So that's the beauty of this even today, the functional decomposition diagram, FDD. Here's an example of one that looks at a whole business area. So, by the way, I have lost somehow by doing what I just did now, with the technical people who are listening out there, I've lost my questions right now. I don't see the questions coming up. So if it doesn't come back soon, I may just do a little escape, get out of here, and see if I can bring it back again, because I do want to see your questions coming in. Here's an example. I've got a big box store. It breaks down into maybe different functions within that big box store. There's a whole function that has to do with sales, a whole function in the shipping department deals with that, a whole function deals with marketing. I've taken sales and broken that down into its various processes. So placing an order, canceling an order are two aspects of the sales side of things. I've taken place an order and broken it down into identifying customer, enter order detail, obtain payment. These are steps within the process. And because on this particular diagram, it doesn't go down any further. I refer to that as a leaf. A leaf is a term for a task that doesn't get broken down further. Look at the numbering system as well. That's a common thing to do. Because I see that obtain payment is a 1.1.3, that means it's part of 1.1, which is placing an order. And placing an order, which is 1.1, is part of 1, which is sales. So just the number itself gives me a lot of information. And another diagram very widely used is the context diagram. This is extremely high level. If you look at this one, the FDD, it shows us how a process breaks down all the way down to the bottom. The context diagram gets about all those lower levels and only shows big pieces. It's like a diagram that were to show only the pools. And as a matter of fact, for every pool that you've shown on a BPMN, a counterpart would be an external entity on a context diagram. So here's an example of one, mind you, except for the actual system itself, which is the system. So here I've done it two ways. The most common way is the one on the bottom. It's a structured analysis level 0 data flow diagram, also referred to as a context diagram. In this diagram, the bubble in the middle, payroll, is our everything. It's the area of the business that we have encompassed in saying this is what our project's all about. It pulls in information from somewhere and uses that information to produce information that goes somewhere else. In data flow diagrams, and we're going to look at these a little bit more in more detail in a moment, it looks at a process but focuses on how information moves between those processes or sub-processes. So my labels on my arrows are all informational arrows. So the data flow diagram process modeler says, you got payroll? What kind of information do you need to do your job? I need employment records. And where do they come from? They come from the payroll department. And what kind of information do you produce? I produce payments. And where do they go to? They go to the employee. By the way, of course, there'll be more. I've just simplified here. A UML version of doing that, and there is nothing called a context diagram in UML, but you could take, for example, a communication diagram, which is one of the UML diagrams, put a box that represents each object, and here the objects are the level of systems. So, for example, I've got a claim system, I have a fraud system, I have a policy management system. Claims is the one I'm interested in the most. Okay, now I have a colon claim system. The colon is a reminder that it's an object I'm talking about. For you UMLers out there, the other thing I might have been talking about, although not on this diagram, would have been a class. I'm talking about an object, a specific system, not just a type of system. And the nothing before the colon means I haven't named the object, but after the colon is the name of the class. This is all stuff you don't need to know to understand it. what it says is that the claim system sends a message to the policy management system, and what is the content of that message or that request? Please verify coverage. And we know that at some point later, that's why it's number 2, the claim system sends a message to the fraud system. Could you pre-screen for possible fraud? You know, does something look really weird about this claim? And should it be flagged for fraud? So we're getting the same kind of thing, except if you look at what's on the labels of those arrows, it doesn't indicate the information that is passed between systems. What those arrows are indicating is the requests that one system makes of another, the messages that are passed. And that's very typical of OO. And UML communication diagrams are related to object-oriented analysis and design. OO is very interested in objects and the way those objects communicate with each other by passing in messages, by making requests for each other, requests to perform a service on behalf of the other object. So although you're getting something similar going on, the focus is a little bit different. Now before I go in here, I just want to do something to see if I can bring up the window that I lost earlier. So just one moment here. There's my window again. And I'm bringing this back up, and I think I'll have everything going in a moment. Yes, so I now have my questions. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. All right, so final tool we're going to look at, and then really what I really wanted to get to today is so important, is to look at an actual case study. So we're going to follow that through shortly. I'm seeing our time is going much faster than I thought. Here's an example of a DFD data flow model. I'm going to show it very quickly because it is not the model that is actually most widely used, so at least not today. So when would you use this? You'll use this usually have some sort of legacy system. There's our level 0 context diagram that you saw earlier. I've now taken the payroll process, which is really the whole system, and broken it down into some steps. Recording hours, creating payroll, and showed how information moves back and forth. The only new symbol there is the symbol that says work records, and that represents a data store, or typically it's a table. The state diagram, and I'll just flip you to an example right here on 36, is another tool where we look at a particular business object, and many of you are using that here, and look at how it changes its status over time. So if I look at, I want to buy some music, from iTunes, for example. When I make a purchase, that purchase has now been created, but it's sort of still pending, or I haven't even reached that. I've not yet tried to make a payment. Now, the next step is at some point, if I try to make a payment and it was successful, that purchase is now considered to be fully paid. If the payment was denied, payment is pending. If payment is pending, and I make a choice, and I choose to make an alternative payment. Sorry, forget that word choice there. Choice applies to the diamond. If I choose to make if I make an alternative payment, I didn't go through with Visa, but I tried through MasterCard. Now it's paid. So I see that there are two routes at which something can be paid. It might have been paid successfully right away, or might require an intermediate step. It stays in that until we've applied royalties, maybe because every time somebody buys some music, we have to pay the author of that music, so we apply royalties. And once we're done with that, the business can retire that purchase. It has done what it needs to do with it. Finally, we got the business use case diagram. I'll show it quickly. We saw about managing a claim beforehand, and we looked at all the business, the details of the business process. This is a nice overview diagram for that one process if you're using the use case approach. And what it does is it shows us the process and then shows us all of the participants around who are involved. The stick figures, when it's without the circle around them, represent business actors those are entities outside of the business, like the customer, or outside of our business area, like policy management. And when the worker has a circle around it, when the stick figure has a circle around it, and by the way, these particular icons can change. That's not totally standardized yet. Then that represents somebody within the business. So this gives us all of the players. It's a nice overview diagram. Finally, system use case on 41. If I look at a business process and I've drilled down far enough that we can actually see all the details, all the actual IT requirements, then we get this diagram that shows us now the stick figures represent not just anybody involved in the process, but actual users of the IT system. And each of those ovals represents a system use case. A system use case is a task that somebody does with the assistance of the IT system. That's my paraphrasing of it. And typically we size them so that each task could be done in one interaction. So what I'd like to do now in the remaining time, and we've got about 10 minutes left, is to walk you through a case study. So I hope that's good for everybody. And in doing that, I'm going to pull together the tools that we've looked at and see how we drive from business problem down to IT requirements, focusing on the business process modeling side of it. So let's go back to this example of insurance claims, and I use it because most people have made some kind of a claim for insurance, so you have some kind of gut feel for what we're talking about. In the early stages of the project, if we think about how I sketch things out, we want to be able to drive down towards what are the user stories that need to go into that product backlog and that are going to basically define the scope of our IT project. Or if we're using the use case approach, we're going to focus on now, what are the system use cases? Because once we know those, we can really start to size and do a good estimate on, or a half-decent estimate anyway, on how long it'll take us to actually, and what effort will be required to do this. So we start off with some high-level requirements documentation. Some people refer to this as an HLRD. It will contain a business use case diagram, the models that we talked about, both internal and external views, all the way down to the system use cases. So let's have a look at it right here. So here I've got, here is that diagram I showed you earlier, the business use case diagram. Let me explain what's the reason for doing this, because you should never be drawing pictures because we like to draw pretty pictures. I do that too, but that's in my own time as an artist. As a BA, I've got to be having a reason for this. Well, why am I doing this? Because before I get into the details, the very first, often when I walk in as a consultant, I don't know who all the participants are for a business process. I don't even know who I have to interview. I've got one or two contacts. So I walk in and I say, hey, buddy, who are the participants? Who is involved in managing a claim? And they start to tell me there's policy management system because we don't do that part ourselves. There's finance, there's this, there's that. And based upon that, I draw this diagram. I can take this diagram and shop it around to other stakeholders. And the reason I'm explaining this way is I want to focus on how all of these techniques are being used in an interview environment. So I can do all of that, update it, and now I can, from this, start to plan out my interview process. And I can do this, by the way, not just for managed claim, but for all the processes that are part of my project. So if my project was to centralize processes across departments, I'll have something like this for every process. And all of them together could be on one business use case diagram if I so choose. Now, let's go back. You see managed claim here? We see customer service rep, adjuster, and manager of customer services are internal, but external is policy management, finance, and the customer. Look at what I have here on this slide here, slide 47. For every one of those business actors, external entities, I've got a pool. I've got the customer, I've got policy management, I've got finance as a pool, and then my own area claims is in here. Decided to show a lot of detail about the claims side and not much detail about the others because it's not our business. So this is how, we saw this earlier, I'm just showing it now within context, this is how I can start to drill down from the business process into the public view of that process. Where do I go next from there? Well, by the way, another option is instead of drawing it, if I'm using the business use case approach, I can also write it up. Why? Because at this level, text is not bad because it's not too complicated. We're not showing a lot of detailed logic about how the process happens, only about how the business communicates with other business entities during that process. You see here I've got post conditions, a basic flow, alternate flow, and so on. The style of writing with use cases is to write a basic flow first that assumes all goes well, and then all the peculiarities are dealt with as alternate flows or exception flows. So all going well means somebody submits a claim and gets paid, at least from the point of view of the customer. Alternate flows would be where things don't, where there's some deviation from that. Either an error that can be fixed or cannot be fixed. Here, claim denied is something that can't be fixed. Now, the next step after that is whether you did it in text, whether you did it as a diagram, or whether you did it as both. And by the way, when using the use case approach, let's say within RUP, their recommendation is do it as text first when it comes to the public process. If it looks complicated, then draw a diagram to beef it up or to give us a sort of a picture about how the flows connect. The next step, again, regardless of how you modeled up until now, is to do the private process. So here I have it. Here are all the details that we saw earlier about submitting a claim, receiving a claim, and the adjuster being assigned, and so on. And what I'm doing now, really, and here's the value. I'm going around from stakeholder to stakeholder, and I'm including now the workers, right? Those are the people that showed up on my previous diagram, and I'm asking them, what do you do? What do you do? Well, you know, most people only know the little part of the job that they do, but they don't know what happens to the claim once they hand it over to somebody else. But if I go around from person to person to person, I can start to build this from the little pieces of the story that they put together. It's sort of like a Rashomon for anyone who's seen that film. Everybody has their own point of view of something, but here we now get a consolidated view of how they all fit together. And by the way, this also works just as well or even better when you've got everybody in the room at the same time, which is a great way to go if you can. So where do we go from here? The next step, as I said, the whole purpose of this, if there was an IT solution, is going to be to drive towards the IT requirements. So what I've done now is, now we start to sit with our stakeholders and say, what do you think should be part of this project? What makes sense to keep the way that it is? If I'm zeroing in on the IT side, not only should be part of the project, but was going to involve an IT change, or even creating some IT functionality that wasn't there before. So, and how are we going to package it? So I put a circle around receive claim, verify policy coverage, and deny coverage. Why? Because when talking with a stakeholder, they told me that all of those aspects should be automated, or they should be done, we picture somebody in front of the screen doing it, and they're all part of the same IT task, so that when, say, a customer service rep sits down to initially process the claim, they'll be doing all of this in that first step. Now, it's not for you to be able to make that decision, but the tool of business process modeling, this diagram, gives us something to look at when we're making that decision. And we have another one here, assigning an adjuster. We know who does it. It's the manager of client services who does it, and that's all they're going to do. The visiting of the site will be offline in this scenario. However, the submission of the adjuster's report is going to be something that we see the adjuster doing with a screen in front of them. And then the manager of client services finally resolving the claim, deciding finally, you know, yes, we'll pay or we won't pay. That's going to be something that happens automated as well. We can sort of imagine them bringing up the adjuster's reports that are still awaiting resolution, making a choice, and then resolving it. So now when we look at those little red symbols, we now see where the IT solution lies. And I've taken every one of these red circles here and replaced it now with an oval in the system use case diagram. And the swim lane label from here, from this diagram, manager, client services, customer service rep, and so on, that appeared there, they're actually the users who kick off the various use cases. So now we actually have a list of all the IT services that are required to implement this process of processing a claim. We know who the users are for that, and we also know the external systems and other users who will be contacted, other user groups who are going to be contacted once the thing actually starts. And those are the ones that are identified as you'll see them as the actor figure with an arrow going to the actor, like we have for customer. Now, at this point, you have something that's roughly at the level of a user story. And I say roughly, but you have your typical user story if you're using Agile. As a customer service rep, I need to be able to receive a claim, similarly for adjuster and so on. So we can start to size the project out if we get a little bit of a feeling for, we have, for example, even some experience on how long things of this nature, use cases of this nature have taken us to do. And then beyond that, once you're actually within an iteration, or if we're using other approaches when we're actually diving a little bit further, typically as we get close to the point where we're going to implement, we need to know more details about how that particular IT interaction is going to take place. For example, resolving a claim. One way to do that is through text, if we're using the use case approach, and that's usually the first way that we go. Look at this text. It's not very big. Use cases, even when written up, should not be that large. Typically about 9 steps in any one of these flow sections is not unusual at all, especially the basic flow. So the nature of the interaction is here. There's nothing about the design in here. The idea of doing this first is so that we can focus just on workflow and not on what the screens are going to look like, for example. If this piece of text has flows that connect in complicated ways, best practices to attach a diagram. Since we're using use cases, we're already in the world of the UML, so it's very common at this point to switch to activity diagrams for that. And so with that, we've run through the case study. I think we've also run through all of our time as well. I'm not going to be able to get to guidelines for BPMN, but I'm going to turn the floor over, I think, because of our timing, and it looks like I will need to right now. What I want to do really is just be able to get through the slides that cover the case study, and we'll turn it over to the final words.
Cool. Can you forward to slide 63 there, Howard, real quickly, and then we'll hear from BenitaSoft.
Well,
Your chance to shine.
There was a lot of terrific information on there, and I was really impressed watching a lot of the questions come in. It's a really engaged audience on this webinar, and a lot of very interesting process and process modeling questions. Just to remind the audience, my name's Mac McConnell. I'm a Vice President at BenitaSoft, and it really has been our pleasure to sponsor this webinar along with Modern Analyst, and a special thanks to Howard for presenting on the webinar. Just want to remind everybody in the audience that you can use our solution for modeling and process execution, and you can go to benitasoft.com to get a free download. And unlike a lot of open source products that just give a little piece of the software, ours is really a full-featured business process management suite that can run within your organization, either at the department level or even at the highest level, in the corporate level. Some of the most exciting pieces of our technology are how easy it is to connect to other systems. We also have a very intuitive user interface for people to complete and process the tasks of a process, something we call the user XP. Other people might call it a user portal, but it's all in an email type interface. And then our Benita Studio, which is our modeling portion, is all BPMN 2.0 compliant and has a great drag and drop interface so that you can really start to play with your process. And then we have some special tools for analysts to handle process simulation and the KPIs and the reporting that you want to do to make sure that your process is improving over time. So once again, just want to say thanks to Modern Analyst and to Howard for allowing BenitaSoft to participate today. We thought it was a great webinar, and not sure what next steps are, if we're going to have a question session or we're going to close for the day, but I'll hand it back to you guys.
Well, thank you, Mac. What we're probably going to do here is we're respecting everybody's time. It's been pretty fast and furious. So what we can do is just make sure that everybody knows that you can email people. There's the slide for Mac McDonald and BenitaSoft, some of the contact information, so that you
That's
can...
right. So if I just close off too, if I made, yeah, so to any questions I haven't answered, please send them in to info@nobolink.ca. And I guess, where we fit into all this as well for all of you is that what I've done is a really condensed version of something that we cover over 2 days in a business process modeling course. If you go to www.nobolink.ca, you can find out about that and contact us about that if you're interested in more information. So thanks, by the way, also to Modern Analyst for hosting all this, and to Adrian Marchese for inviting me to come. And thanks to all of you for coming by.
Thank you, Mac. Thanks, Howard, for a very informative presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar sponsored by BenitaSoft. I wanted to point out the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. And this concludes today's event, and we hope you have a great day.